She arrived in the United States with a student visa and a heart full of dreams. But it only took one mistake, a dirty dish and a surprise inspection to turn her life into a nightmare. Detained, humiliated and alone in a shelter, Maria discovered that the real test wasn't in the classroom, but in the struggle to not lose her own dignity. On the morning Maria Fernanda boarded her flight to the United States, Bogotá dawned grey, as if the sky also knew that something important was about to happen. It was August 12th, and El Dorado International Terminal was packed with travelers. But for her, the world came down to one goodbye: her mother. She hugged her so tight that her heart almost burst out of her chest. In that embrace, they said everything they couldn't put into words. Neither of them cried, but both knew they were breaking inside. If you like interesting stories, hit like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the bell to not miss any of our content. And tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. We'd love to hear from you. Maria was 22, with straight hair pulled back in a tight braid, steady eyes, and a subtle smile that hid more fear than she would admit. It was her first time leaving Colombia. She carried a partial scholarship to study business administration at a community college in Southern California, and an F1 visa that filled her with pride. She had gotten the scholarship after months of letters, interviews, and certificate translations. But even with the tuition discount, they knew the rest would be a battle. Her family, a nurse mother who worked nights caring for elderly people, and two younger siblings still living at home, had sold their father's motorcycle, raffled off appliances, and even held fundraisers at church just to ensure she could board that plane. Maria couldn't fail. The family's future, even if no one said it out loud, depended on her success. On the plane, sitting by the window, she watched the clouds with her heart racing. She felt excitement, yes, but also a knot in her stomach. She didn't know anyone on the other side, didn't speak English fluently, and only had enough to pay for 2 months of rent and cheap food. And even so, she smiled, because arriving with little was better than never having left. Upon landing in Los Angeles, her eyes lit up. It was another world, people from everywhere, signs in English all around, huge cars, different sounds. The immigration officer asked questions about her stay, her university, her support. Maria proudly showed her papers and answered with broken but firm English. When the stamp was placed on her passport, she took a deep breath. Ya está. Now my life really begins. The student residence was an old, stuffy building downtown. She shared a room with 3 other girls: May from China, Adana from Nigeria, and Jimena from Mexico. The space was cramped, but full of voices, cultures, and different smells. They shared the bathroom, microwave, and the anxieties of starting a life away from home. On the first day of class, Maria got lost 3 times inside campus. Technical English seemed like another language, and the professors spoke too fast. But she recorded everything, went back home and listened again, paused, looked up words in the dictionary, made notes in Spanish. She spent hours studying alone. Sometimes she forgot to eat. I just have to work harder than everyone else, she told herself. She discovered that food on campus was expensive, so she learned to cook rice and eggs on a hidden electric burner. Other students laughed at the simple lunches she brought, but she didn't care. She had goals. She had faith. As weeks passed, her life became an intense routine. Morning classes, afternoon studying, evening reading. She only went out on Sundays to explore the surroundings, walk through parks, and call her mother from public Wi-Fi. She shared news enthusiastically, but avoided talking about difficulties. She never mentioned falling asleep hungry sometimes, or that the fear of making mistakes in English made her avoid conversations with Americans. She only said, "I'm learning so much, Mom. Everything's going well." Her mother, on the other side of the phone, listened in silence. She didn't want to worry her more than necessary, but knew her daughter was enduring more than she let on. She sent messages with phrases like, "God is with you, my girl," or "Remember you're worth more than any obstacle." Maria stuck these messages on the walls of her locker as if they were amulets, and every time insecurity hit, she looked at them and took a deep breath. But California was expensive, much more than she and her mother had calculated. Even saving to the extreme, money began to disappear like sand through her fingers. Still, she remained strong. She believed that if she could make it through the first semester, some solution would appear. A bigger scholarship, a job on campus, a miracle. But what was to come wasn't a miracle, it was life. Raw, unexpected, unfair. And Maria Fernandez still didn't know that soon all her effort would be put to the test, not by a multiple-choice exam, but by a dirty dish, an impossible choice, and a chain that doesn't appear in any business administration textbook. It was a Tuesday night when everything began to fall apart. Maria had returned late from the library. She had spent days preparing an extensive paper on social economics in Latin America, which represented 40% of her grade. She was tired, but satisfied. She had spent more than 6 hours researching in English, translating terms and connecting ideas. That night, for the first time in weeks, she thought she deserved a little rest. She made tea with hot water from the bathroom sink, put on her headphones, and lay down. The other girls were already asleep. She closed her eyes. But just when she was about to fall asleep, her phone vibrated. It was a video call from her mother. At that hour, something must be wrong. She answered immediately. On the other side of the screen, the image shook. Her mother had red eyes, a face without makeup, and an old cloth tied around her head. She tried to smile, but her voice wouldn't come out. Maria felt a chill. "Mommy, what happened?" The silence lasted too long. Finally, her mother swallowed and let it all out at once. "My love, they fired me. The lady I was caring for passed away, and they can't pay me anymore. I don't know how long I'll be without income. And we won't be able to send you money this month." Maria remained motionless. Her heart began beating so hard she could feel it in her neck. She tried to stay calm. She smiled without showing her teeth, like someone trying to calm a child. "It's okay, Mom. I'll manage. Don't worry about that now." "No, my dear, don't say that. You need to eat, pay for your room, your things. I'm looking for another job, but—" "Mom!" she interrupted firmly. "Really, I'm fine. I have some savings. In a few days it'll work out." Lie. Maria had no more than $45 in her account. Rent was due in 2 weeks, and she had only eaten an old sandwich in the last 24 hours. But her mother didn't need to know that. She didn't deserve more weight on her shoulders. When she hung up the call, Maria sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands were shaking. She felt a hole in her stomach, an emptiness that mixed fear and powerlessness. She wanted to scream, but she remained silent. She just let the tears flow, without sound, without commotion, like those who know they have no choice. The next day, she couldn't concentrate anymore. In accounting class, everything seemed like noise. The numbers didn't make sense. The professor's words came from a distance, as if she were listening underwater. Her stomach hurt. She was hungry and ashamed. In the following days, she began selling the few things she had. A new blouse her mother had given her, her headphones, an expensive marketing book. She went to Facebook groups and posted, "Almost new campus delivery." She got some money, enough to eat for a week, but rent, that was another monster. To save money, she stopped taking the bus and started walking long distances. Sometimes, she pretended to be sick to avoid group work that required in-person meetings. She no longer went anywhere. She spent weekends hidden in the library to avoid having to admit she couldn't afford a simple coffee. She started skipping meals. She drank water to trick her stomach. One day she fainted while climbing stairs. She said it was from lack of sleep. No one suspected. Her roommates noticed she was quieter, but Maria kept saying, "I'm fine, just tired." always smiling, always disguising, like so many other Latina girls who learn from an early age that crying doesn't solve anything, working does. Then, on a cold October night, she found an ad on the library bulletin board. Kitchen helper needed. Nights only, cash payment. It didn't say anything about contracts or paperwork, nor did it require fluent English, just a note at the end. Ask for Oscar at the 7-Eleven corner. Maria looked at the paper for long minutes. She knew what it meant. She knew that with an F1 visa, working off campus was illegal, that she could lose everything. But she also knew she had no other alternatives. For 3 days she fought with herself. She thought about calling the university, about telling the truth. But who would listen? Who would care? On Friday, she went to the address. A Mexican restaurant, small, smelling of grease and spicy salsa. Oscar was a bald man with a rough voice and suspicious look. He asked if she had experience. She said no, but that she learned quickly. He looked her up and down and simply said, "You have hands." That's enough. They paid her in cash, $15 an hour. She washed dishes, swept, took out the trash. The first day ended with a broken back and nails full of grease. But she had eaten. She had returned home with money. And for the first time in weeks, she slept without hunger. But she also knew she was walking on thin ice. Any mistake, any inspection, and everything would end. Maria didn't tell anyone. She kept that secret like someone hiding a wound under their clothes. Because for her, surviving was already an act of bravery. What she didn't imagine was that just a few days later, someone would enter that kitchen with a badge on their chest and the power to tear away everything she had left. For years, Maria had heard her mother repeat a phrase like a prayer, "Choose what's right, even when no one is watching." But life in exile doesn't understand principles. Sometimes surviving means doing what you never imagined, even what you know is wrong. The kitchen job wasn't what Maria had dreamed of when imagining her life in the United States. She washed dishes until her fingers wrinkled like dried plums. The steam made her sweat profusely, and the noise of pots and pans drilled into her ears. Grease stuck to her clothes, her hair, her dreams, but there was also a part of that job that made her feel alive. The routine, though hard, gave her a reason to wake up, and the money, though scarce, allowed her to eat twice a day. Fear, however, was her constant companion. She slept with her heart alert, as if at any moment someone would knock on the door and say, "We know what you did." During the day, she continued going to classes. She strived to maintain her grades. She had managed to get B's and A's, and even a perfect score on a finance exam. But she didn't tell anyone, not her mother, not her roommates, because none of that would matter if they discovered her working illegally. Nothing. One night, while scrubbing an industrial tray in the back kitchen, Oscar, her boss, approached silently. He had a hard look and a folded paper in his hand. "Look, girl," he said without beating around the bush. "They warned me that next week there might be an ICE inspection in this area. They've already hit other businesses around here. If they come, you go out the back door. I don't want problems." Maria felt a void in her stomach. She stayed still, with her hands in dirty water. She didn't respond, just nodded. That night, when she returned to her room, she locked herself in the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and asked herself if any of this was worth it. She knew she was violating the conditions of her visa. She knew that if caught, she would be detained, deported, and could never set foot on US soil again. But she also knew she couldn't return to Colombia empty-handed, not after everything her family had sacrificed. It was a decision no student should have to make, choosing between hunger and illegality, between dignity and desperation, between clean dreams and the dirt of a kitchen that didn't forgive mistakes. That week, Maria got sick. She had a fever, sore throat, and a persistent cough that wouldn't let her sleep. She couldn't afford a doctor, so she self-medicated with expired pills another Latina student had given her. Even so, she didn't stop working or attending classes. Stress accumulated. She began losing weight. Her eyes sank, her nails broke, but the worst was the guilt, a silent, constant guilt. Every time she entered class, she felt like everyone knew, that they looked at her differently, that at any moment someone would stand up and say, "You shouldn't be here." And yet she resisted. One Sunday morning, while cleaning the small room she shared with the other girls, she found a letter from her mother inside one of her books. She didn't remember putting it there. It was a handwritten page with trembling letters stained with tears. It said, "My dear, if you ever feel lost, remember who you are. You are my strength. You are my pride. Don't let this country make you forget what you're made of. You're not alone." Maria cried silently for hours, not from sadness, but from the pain of having to hide so much, from the weight of carrying everything and not being able to share it with anyone. That same afternoon, while walking to work, she noticed something strange. There was a car parked in front of the restaurant with two men inside. One of them had a vest she couldn't make out clearly. She felt a chill. She quickened her pace, entered through the back door, and went straight to Oscar. "Is there anything weird today?" she asked, lowering her voice. He frowned and looked out the window. He said nothing, but she knew the answer from the way his face changed. "Get out through the kitchen now." Maria dropped the rag, took off her apron, and ran out through the back of the place. She ran without looking back, with her heart in her throat and her soul in pieces. She hid in a laundromat for hours. She didn't dare go back to her room. She didn't know if it was a false alarm or the beginning of the end. That night she didn't sleep. She didn't go to classes the next day either. She only thought about one thing. How long could she keep living like this? She was at her limit of everything, physical, emotional, legal, and she knew that sooner rather than later she would either face the consequences or give up everything. But then, just when she thought she couldn't continue, something unexpected happened. Someone whom she never imagined was going to cross her path and change her story forever. Just 3 days had passed since that false alarm in front of the restaurant, but Maria didn't feel at peace. Although nothing had actually happened, the tension had stuck to her skin, like the smell of grease on her work clothes. She walked hunched over, always looking down, waiting for someone to give her away at any moment. And then came Wednesday, a day like any other, until it wasn't. The day started calmly. Maria had felt a bit better from her cold, though she still had a dry cough that scratched her throat. That day, Oscar wasn't there. An older assistant named Gabriel was supervising the kitchen. Maria wasn't on his good side, but she avoided conflicts. She washed dishes faster than usual, as if her urgency could prevent or erase or redeem. Around 7 in the evening, the restaurant began to fill up. There was a group of German tourists, 2 large tables with Mexican families, and an American couple talking too loudly. Music played from a speaker in the corner, and the kitchen was chaos with orders, shouting, steaming pans, and dishes everywhere. It was right in the middle of that everyday storm when the front door opened and everything changed. 4 men in dark jackets with visible badges crossed the threshold. One of them shouted in English, "Immigration and Customs Enforcement." "Nobody move." The room fell silent. A woman let out a choked scream. Waiters dropped their trays. From the kitchen, Maria heard the phrase like thunder. Her body reacted before her mind. She dropped the plate she was holding and ran toward the back door. But she had barely taken 3 steps when the door burst open. 2 agents were there. One of them pointed at her without hesitation. "You, stay right there. Hands where I can see them." Maria raised her shaking hands. She was wearing her stained apron, sweat-soaked blouse, hair half tied back. Her eyes pleaded for something her voice couldn't articulate. "Please, I'm just a student." They didn't listen. They didn't want to listen. One of the officers firmly grabbed her arms. The other placed metal handcuffs that were tighter than necessary on her. Maria felt herself falling apart inside, as if all her effort, all her sacrifice, had crumbled in a second. They took her out through the front door. In front of customers, in front of children watching her with fear, in front of waiters who didn't dare say anything. No one asked her name. No one wanted to hear her side. To them, she was just another illegal immigrant caught in a routine raid. On the way to the ice van, the night wind hit her with fury. The jacket she wore was thin, and November's California cold is unforgiving. They made her get in the vehicle without allowing a phone call, without explanation, just cold stares. Just institutional silence. The journey to the detention center was long. Maria went with her head down among 3 other detained people. A Guatemalan woman sobbing non-stop, a young Salvadoran with closed eyes, and an older man praying in a low voice. No one spoke, no one asked. Fear filled everything. Upon arrival, they took her belongings. Phone, earrings, the cheap watch her mother had given her before leaving. They gave her a grey t-shirt, cotton pants, and plastic flip-flops. They gave her a superficial medical examination, took her fingerprints, and sent her to a shared cell with 7 other women. No one looked at her. No one greeted her. The place was a freezing concrete cube. The lights never went off. There was no privacy. The mattress was thin foam on a metal base. The bathroom had no door. Cold seeped through the cracks. Hunger was constant. Humiliation, even more so. Maria spent the first night without closing her eyes. Not because she didn't want to sleep, but because she couldn't stop thinking. She thought about her mother, about her classes, about her dream, about everything she had sacrificed. And now she was just another number in a system that admitted no nuances. During the next day, she tried to explain herself. She asked to speak with someone, a lawyer, a university representative, a phone call. But the answers were always the same. Wait your turn. No information available. Sit down. Don't talk. The other women in the cell shared similar stories. All had come seeking something better. All had made a mistake. And all were paying with the same currency, forgetfulness. 5 days passed. During that time, Maria wrote letters by hand, with the few papers they gave her. One to the university, begging for help. Another to her mother, which might never arrive. Another to herself, where she wrote, "I am not a criminal. I came to study, to better myself. If someone sees me, if someone hears me, don't leave me here." She didn't know that amid that darkness, someone would read one of those letters, and that person would change her story in a way she never could have imagined. But for now, she only had the cold, the silence, and the certainty that her life no longer belonged to her. Days in the detention center weren't counted by clocks. They were measured by the number of times the white ceiling light flickered, by plastic trays with tasteless food, by the constant echo of keys, hard footsteps, and metal doors opening and closing like thunder without rain. For Maria, time became a thick fog. She didn't know if it was Tuesday or Saturday, if it was 9 in the morning or 2 in the morning. There, everything was grey, even hope. The cold was another character. It crept through the walls, got under the thin clothes they had given her, numbed her toes, and froze her bones during the night. The blankets were too thin, and the mattress, an irony, harder than the floor, crueler than concrete. The cell was shared with other migrant women. Some were young like her, others older, with wrinkles of accumulated anguish. Few spoke. No one cried out loud. In that place, crying was exposing yourself. It was showing weakness. And weakness there was paid for dearly. Maria had no lawyer. No one explained what the next step would be. She only knew that her visa had been automatically cancelled from the moment she was detained, working without authorization. And with that, she officially became a violator, one more among thousands. What hurt most wasn't the rancid food or the constant cold. What broke her most was the silence of the university that didn't respond to her letters, the silence of the outside world, the silence that enveloped her in that cell like an invisible fabric squeezing her inside. During the first days, she tried to keep busy mentally. She mentally reviewed concepts from her classes, remembered poems her mother had taught her as a child, tried to visualize her old room in Bogota. But everything faded with each sleepless night. One night, while the others slept, or pretended to sleep, Maria sat on the cold floor with her back against the wall. She took out a piece of paper they had given her after requesting sheets to write home. With a tiny pencil, she began a letter. "Dear University, my name is Maria Fernanda Gaitan. I am 22 years old. I came to study. I have no criminal record. I have no family here. I am in a detention center, but I'm not a danger. I'm just scared. Please help me." It was brief. Not because she didn't have much to say, but because she knew probably no one would read it all. She folded it carefully and kept it inside one of the few old books they let circulate among the detainees. The next morning, when a volunteer passed by distributing things, Maria discreetly handed her the book with the letter inside. She didn't know if the woman would read it. She didn't know if anyone would even open it, but she needed to do something, because if she didn't fight, who would do it for her? The guards weren't openly cruel, but they weren't human either. They treated her with mechanical distance. They spoke to her in fast English, as if expecting her to understand or give up. When she asked about her case, they only responded, "Wait, when there's an update, you'll be informed." After a week, she no longer expected anything, just that the next morning wouldn't be worse than the previous one. She had learned to survive in that new world, slept little, spoke less, and walked in circles within the permitted margins, over and over, as if moving was the only thing she could still decide for herself. But amid that emotional desert, there was an older woman who looked at her attentively. Her name was Rosaura. She was Honduran. She was about 50, with tired eyes and a tenderness that hadn't withered. One night, when Maria couldn't fall asleep, Rosaura approached her and said in a low voice, "You have something in your eyes, girl. Something not many people keep here. Don't let it die. Don't let them kill you inside." Maria didn't respond, but that night she cried, inside, as if those words had opened a crack in her armor. The next day, while lining up for breakfast, a woman dressed in a white shirt and jeans entered the cell. She wasn't a guard, not a detainee either. She wore a badge with her name, Valeria Dominguez, volunteer social worker. "Maria Fernanda Gaitan?" she asked loudly, looking around. Maria's heart almost stopped. "Yes, that's me." Valeria approached her, smiled gently and said, "I read your letter. I don't promise miracles, but I can promise you're not alone. Not anymore." At that moment, for the first time since being detained, Maria felt something warm run through her chest. It was hope, small, fragile, but alive. If you're enjoying this story, hit like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay up to date with all our content. Valeria Dominguez wasn't surprised to find stories like Maria Fernanda's. She had heard hundreds in her life as a volunteer social worker in immigration detention centers, women who crossed deserts with children in their arms, young people caught in raids, mothers who lost track of time, waiting for a hearing that never came. What surprised her about Maria wasn't her situation, but the way she told it. There was truth in her eyes, a mixture of fear, dignity, and desperation that couldn't be faked. Maria wasn't asking for pity. She was asking to be seen. In a small interview room, surrounded by thin walls that let the constant murmur of the center seep through, Valeria offered her a bottle of water and some silence. Maria drank cautiously, as if even that could be a mistake. Then, in a low but firm voice, she began recounting her story from the beginning. She omitted no details. She spoke of the F1 visa, her partial scholarship, the promise she had made to her mother before leaving. She confessed how the lack of resources forced her to make decisions that went against immigration rules, but which, for her, were the only option to survive. She didn't blame anyone. She just exposed her truth with a sincerity that tightened the chest. Valeria listened without interrupting. She took notes, but didn't take her eyes off her. She didn't want to miss any gesture, any pause, any tear that resisted coming out. "Do you have anyone here? Any contact at the university?" she finally asked. "I wrote a letter but got no response. I don't know anyone else. I'm alone," Maria replied, looking down. Valeria took a few seconds before speaking. Then she said something Maria didn't expect to hear in that place. "You're not alone. Not anymore. We're going to find a way out." From that day on, Maria's life changed pace. Valeria began moving between papers, phones, emails. She located the university's student affairs department. She explained the situation. She insisted. She pressed. She demanded. Not everyone wanted to collaborate, but a professor, the same one who had once told Maria that her effort was admirable, remembered her name, her face, and agreed to write a letter on her behalf. That gesture, small as it was, served as a basis to request an emergency hearing with an immigration judge. The argument was clear. Maria was an outstanding student with no criminal record, who had committed a minor violation driven by necessity, and who deserved at least to finish her semester before any deportation. The process wasn't simple. There were obstacles, administrative silences, initial rejections. But Valeria didn't give up. She knew the corridors of the system like few others. She knew which doors to knock on. She knew how to insist without being ignored. Maria, meanwhile, remained in the detention center, but something inside her had changed. She no longer walked like a shadow. She no longer avoided eye contact. The other detainees noticed something was happening. Some asked. Others just watched her with a mixture of curiosity and quiet envy. Each time Valeria visited, she brought news, sometimes good, sometimes frustrating, but she brought something, and that was already more than Maria had received in weeks. One afternoon, after a long meeting with the center's volunteer lawyers, Valeria entered the visiting room with a different expression. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes shone in a special way. "Maria," she said, sitting across from her, "the judge agreed to hear your case. You have a hearing next week." Maria didn't react at first. It was as if she didn't understand the words. But then emotion hit her full force. Her eyes clouded. She wanted to thank her, but couldn't find how. She only said, almost in a whisper, "Thank you for not giving up on me." "You're not a case, Maria," Valeria responded. "You're a story that deserves to be told in full, and it hasn't ended yet." The days before the hearing were the longest. Maria reviewed over and over what she would say. She didn't want to seem weak, but not arrogant either. She wasn't looking for excuses, but she also wouldn't allow herself to be seen as a criminal. She practiced in front of the opaque metal mirror in the cell. She breathed deeply. She repeated phrases her mother had taught her, with the truth, even if it hurts. The night before, Rosora, the Honduran woman with whom she shared a cell, gave her a small rosary made of blue plastic beads. "I don't know if you believe in anything," she said, "but this has been with me since I crossed the border. Now it's yours." Maria received it with both hands, as if being given a piece of faith. On the morning of the hearing, they gave her different clothes: black pants without a belt and a simple white blouse. They let her hair down. They gave her basic instructions on how to behave before the judge. But no one had to tell her how to tell her story. She already knew. She entered the room with the rosary hidden in her pocket and her heart beating like a drum. When she saw the judge, she took a deep breath. And when they asked her why she deserved to stay, she didn't cry. She spoke. With a firm voice, with truth as her shield, the hearing ended without promises, but with something Maria hadn't felt in weeks: dignity. The judge didn't issue a final verdict that day. However, after listening to her, with her clear words, her unadorned story, and her impeccable grades delivered by the university, he took a long pause, breathed deeply, and said, "We will grant you a temporary relief measure. You may finish your semester. Then, your case will be reviewed again." Then Valeria, sitting in the back of the room, closed her eyes and pressed her lips to keep from crying. Maria didn't fully understand the legal scope of what the judge had said, but she felt that finally someone had seen her as a person, not as a number, not as illegal, as what she was, a young woman with a future trapped in a circumstance bigger than herself. 3 days later, she was transferred from the detention center to a special shelter for vulnerable young immigrants. The place wasn't luxurious, not even comfortable, but it had colorful walls, windows that let in light, and volunteers who greeted you by name. Upon arrival, they gave her a small room with 2 single beds. She shared the space with a Guatemalan girl named Sylvia, who had crossed the border alone at 17. Despite their different backgrounds, they quickly became friends. Shared trauma created bonds faster than any conversation. The room was simple: a narrow bed, a plastic table, a worn-out closet, and a makeshift shelf where Maria organized her books. But for her, that was a castle. For the first time in weeks, she could shower privately, sleep with the lights off, eat warm food. During the first days at the shelter, Maria spoke little. She walked slowly. She observed everything in silence. She still carried fear on her shoulders. The fear that all of this was temporary, a mistake, a brief dream. But she soon realized that there, in that small space shared with other girls invisible to the system, there was a strange kind of freedom. Valeria continued to follow her closely. Sometimes she called to ask how classes were going, what she needed, or simply to say, "I'm proud of you." Maria clung to those words like a lifeline. Although she still couldn't return to campus, the university had agreed to let her continue her studies remotely. They sent materials via email, and some professors even offered to record classes so she could keep up. Secretly, in a corner of the shelter where Wi-Fi barely reached, Maria studied every night with a notebook on her lap and a flashlight between her teeth. Sylvia watched her with curiosity. "And you really think you're going to be able to graduate?" she asked one night, between incredulous laughs. Maria smiled, tired but sure. "I didn't come this far to give up." Every day, she wrote in an old diary someone had donated. There she noted phrases, thoughts, assignments. She also wrote letters to her mother, whom she still couldn't see. She told her everything, even the smallest details. How the soup smelled, how the other girls sang in the afternoons, how she felt the wind creep through the window every dawn. It was her way of continuing to feel alive. The shelter organized group activities, art workshops, yoga, English courses. Maria didn't participate much at first, but one day, at one of the writing workshops, they invited her to share something. She hesitated. She was afraid of exposing herself, of crying in front of strangers. But she took a breath and read a fragment from her diary. "When I was arrested, I thought my world had ended, but sometimes the world just changes shape, and you have to learn to breathe inside that new space." The room fell silent. Then one of the girls began clapping. Then another. Then all of them. That day, Maria understood something important. Her story wasn't just hers. It belonged to many. And sharing it wasn't weakness. It was resistance. Little by little, she recovered the light in her eyes. She dared to laugh more, to help others, to tell her story without shame. Every time she finished a university assignment, she celebrated it as a victory. She had no certainty about the future, but the present, however hard it was, belonged to her. Sometimes, at night, while the shelter slept and silence filled the hallway, Maria sat by the window and looked at the sky. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and the air had that smell of promise that only early mornings bring. She then remembered that phrase her mother used to tell her as a child. "When you feel like you can't go on, look at your feet. If they're still firm, continue, step by step." And she did, even without certainties. Even though her world was just a room with thin walls, because sometimes the smallest place in the world can house a heart that can't contain itself for so much faith. The date arrived faster than Maria expected. The final hearing. The one that would determine if she could stay in the United States or if she would have to pack her story, her achievements, her scars, and return to Bogota as if nothing lived had legal value. It was an immigration hearing like so many others. But for her, it was her entire life. Valeria prepared her patiently. They reviewed documents, transcripts, letters from professors, medical reports from the detention center, evidence of her participation in the shelter, and testimonies from volunteers. Even Sylvia, her roommate, wrote a handwritten letter saying, "Maria taught me that even in the worst moments, one can keep believing in something." The day of the hearing dawned cloudy, as if the sky knew that day wouldn't breathe easily. Maria was transported to the courthouse dressed in formal clothes the shelter lent her, a long-sleeved white blouse and navy blue pants. She wore her hair pulled back with a borrowed hair tie. In her right pocket, hidden, her small blue rosary, the same one Rosora had given her in the cell weeks earlier. She pressed it with her hand without it showing, as if by touching it, she could make everything hurt less. Upon entering the courtroom, her heart was pounding. It wasn't a court like in movies. There was no jury, no cameras, just an immigration judge in the back, an American flag in a corner, and an interpreter sitting next to her, although she no longer needed her that much. English had been tattooed on her skin, like everything else. Valeria was by her side. She signaled with her eyes, as if saying, "Trust yourself." The judge was an older man, with an expressionless face, accustomed to hearing pleas. He reviewed papers without saying much. Then he looked up and said, "Ms. Gaitan, you have the floor." Maria took a deep breath. She stood up. She felt her legs trembling, but didn't back down. "Your Honor," she began in English, "I came to this country with a student visa because I wanted to be the first in my family to graduate from a foreign university. I didn't come to do harm. I came to build." She paused. No one moved. "I made a mistake. I know that. But I also know that mistake doesn't define everything I am. I worked washing dishes because I had no other way to eat. I didn't steal, I didn't lie, I didn't hide, I just tried to survive." Her voice trembled a little, but she didn't look down. "I kept studying from the shelter. I finished my assignments. My professors can attest to that. I work hard every day to honor the sacrifice of my mother, who sold what little she had so I could be here. I only ask for an opportunity to finish what I started, to give back to this country somehow what it has given me." She ended with a phrase she had written and rehearsed during nights. "I don't want pity. I want justice." The silence became heavier than the air. The interpreter didn't even need to translate. The judge had understood her perfectly. Valeria looked at her with glassy eyes. The court clerk stopped writing for a second. The interpreter herself wiped a disguised tear with her sleeve. No one spoke, no one coughed, no one breathed loudly. It was as if, for a moment, the entire system had stopped to look at the heart of a young Latina who dared to speak without fear. The judge, after a few eternal seconds, looked down. He reviewed the papers again. He took a breath. Then, he said, "Temporary permission to remain is granted until completion of the university semester. Your situation will be re-evaluated at the close of the academic period. During this time, you must remain under supervision. You will need to report every 2 weeks. But you are permitted to study, work within established terms, and reside in the approved shelter. Your case is not closed, but you're not being turned away either." Maria closed her eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just released the air, held in her chest like someone unloading centuries of weight. Valeria took her hand under the table. It was a small victory. A breath, a window opening in the middle of the wall. Upon leaving the courthouse, Maria didn't want to talk. She walked in silence to the car that would take her back to the shelter. Upon getting in, she looked out the window and for the first time in weeks felt that the sky, though still grey, was no longer a threat. it was a promise. That night, at the shelter, the other girls received her with hugs. Even Sylvia, who usually presented herself as tough, made her a hot tea and left a note on her bed that said, "You gave me faith," without realizing it. Maria locked herself in her room, opened her notebook and wrote, "Today I didn't win the war, but I won the right to keep fighting, and that here is worth more than a diploma." Then she lay down on the narrow bed, with the rosary in her hand, and slept like she hadn't since Bogota, without fear, with a light soul, with hope alive. The judge's decision wasn't a definitive victory, but for Maria, it felt like a truce granted by destiny. She had until the end of the semester to close a cycle that, despite being marked by pain, was also full of learning, faith, and resistance. The days following the hearing were intense. Maria, still living in the shelter, returned to the university in person, though with certain restrictions and under legal monitoring. Not everyone knew what had happened, but some professors, seeing her enter the classroom again, stood up silently and offered her a smile that said more than words. The campus was no longer the same, or maybe it was she who had changed. She walked with her head held high, but with a more mature gaze. She was no longer the young woman full of illusion who had arrived months earlier with the blue backpack and hope at her fingertips. She was now someone who knew the weight of humiliation, the coldness of cells, and the silence of invisibility. But she also knew the value of being heard, the power of continuing. The university allowed her to take her exams intensively. She focused like never before. She didn't go out, didn't get distracted. She went from the shelter to class, and from class to the library. She studied in silence, ate what was necessary, slept just enough. Each submitted assignment was an act of vindication. Each passed grade, a scar learning to shine. Her classmates began to notice her change. Some approached with curiosity, others with respect. One of them, Tomas, a Mexican-American young man with whom she had shared a group project before her disappearance, said to her one day, "I thought you had gone forever, but seeing you here, after everything, you're braver than all of us combined." Maria didn't respond. She just smiled humbly and kept walking. The routine was demanding. There was no time for distractions or thinking about the future. She knew her stay was still under review, that at any moment a new order could arrive, a new hearing, a final decision. But she also knew that if that moment came, at least she would have left her mark. She would have finished what she started. During the last weeks of the semester, she wrote a final essay for one of her most difficult subjects, business ethics and leadership. The topic was free choice. Maria titled hers, "The Invisible Decision, When Surviving Becomes a Fault." She was honest. She told her story using the language of ethics, analyzing her experience as a migrant student who was forced to break rules to not give up to misery. She didn't play the victim, but she didn't justify herself either. She argued with data, with laws, with humanity. The professor, upon reading it, wrote by hand on the last page, "I don't know what will become of you after this semester, but if the world has any justice, you'll be part of it. Thank you for teaching us more than any book." The day of the last class arrived. It was December. It was cold, and students were beginning to leave for vacation. Maria carried her notebook, her thermos with coffee, and a letter she had written for each of her professors. She didn't say goodbye, she said thank you. In each envelope, she left a brief note. "Thank you for not letting me fall, even when you didn't know I was drowning." After the final class ended, she sat down until everyone left. Then she walked slowly through the hallways. She passed by the library, through the gardens where she had once sat to cry silently, by the stairs where she had fainted from hunger months earlier. She touched each space with her gaze, like someone saying goodbye to a house that was both shelter and prison. Before leaving, she left an envelope at the college secretary's office. Inside, a special paper she had prepared on her own. Along with it, a note written in her firm handwriting. My diploma won't come in paper form, but every class I took, every night I resisted, and every tear I didn't show are worth more than any degree. Thank you for giving me a place, even if it was for a moment. I'll never forget it. And she left without looking back. At the shelter, the other girls organized a small farewell party. They didn't know if it would be final, but something in the atmosphere said yes. There was hot chocolate, soft music, and long hugs. Sylvia, who had been her roommate, gave her a bracelet woven with red thread. So you don't forget that here you were family, not a case or a number, Maria cried inside, because her body no longer allowed tears on the surface. She was full of memories, of gratitude, of pain transformed into strength. She packed her suitcase with fewer things than she had brought, but with more history than she had ever imagined carrying. The blue rosary remained in her pocket, and also a notebook full of notes, thoughts, and letters she never sent. She still didn't know what the next step would be, if they would let her stay, if she would have to return, if they would call her to another hearing, but inside her, something had changed forever. Because that young woman who arrived trembling at Los Angeles airport with a partial scholarship was now leaving, perhaps for the last time, with the respect of those who saw her resist, with her dignity intact, and a farewell without shame, without defeat, without resentment, a farewell with honor. Bogota received her with soft rain and a sky heavy with low clouds, as if it also knew she wasn't returning the same. There was no marching band, no family waiting with signs. Just her mother, with swollen eyes from crying so much, holding an old coat and a bag with warm arepas. Maria stepped off the plane with firm steps. The backpack on her shoulders seemed lighter, but the weight in her chest was dense. When she saw her mother, she didn't run, she didn't cry, she just hugged her tightly, like someone trying to glue together pieces of a life the world had tried to break. "Forgive me, my daughter," her mother murmured, caressing her face. "I wanted you to have a future, not this." Maria didn't let her finish. "I'm here, Mom. I'm alive. That's already a future." Returning to Colombia was like entering an old movie, familiar and alien at the same time. Her neighborhood, her neighbors, the sound of buses, the smell of bread in the morning, everything seemed the same, except her. Now she had a different gaze, one that couldn't be explained with words. For weeks, she barely left home. She answered university emails from an internet cafe, read old books she had left behind, and wrote. A lot. She wrote to let go, to not forget, to transform. Little by little, she began looking for work. She didn't have an official diploma, but she had advanced English, academic research experience, and a story that didn't fit any resume. Even so, she was rejected several times. Companies wanted degrees, local references, emotional stability, and all she had was scars. Until one day, an international company, with headquarters in Bogota and operations in the United States, saw something different in her profile. The interview was conducted in English. Maria spoke firmly. She didn't tell her entire story, but made clear she knew real life far beyond management theories. She was hired as a project assistant for immigration affairs. Irony or poetic justice, now she helped coordinate programs for young Colombians seeking study scholarships abroad. She prepared documentation, reviewed visa clauses, explained risks, and gave advice she never had. In every interview with a new student, she told them, "Read everything, don't sign without understanding, and if you ever feel like everything is crashing down on you, seek help. Don't do alone what I did without knowing." Over time, her story began circulating, first among colleagues, then in school talks. She was invited to a youth migration conference. She told her experience without tears, but with truth. Her voice, though soft, was moving. A journalist heard her and asked to write about her. Maria hesitated. She didn't want exposure. She didn't seek fame. But she accepted with one condition, that they wouldn't present her as the one who was deported, but as the one who didn't let herself be defeated. The article was titled, Maria Gaitan, the student who crossed borders with books and returned with scars that teach more than a diploma. After that, she was contacted by young people, mothers, teachers. Some asked for advice, others just wanted to say thank you. And every time someone spoke to her, Maria responded the same. I'm not an example. I was just one more who chose not to give up. 2 years passed. Maria was promoted within the company. She began leading projects, forming networks with migrant organizations, representing her story without fear. One ordinary afternoon, while reviewing documents, she received an unexpected email. It came from her old university in California. The subject read, Honorary Academic Recognition. She thought it was a mistake. Upon opening it, she read, In virtue of your extraordinary perseverance, academic commitment, and contribution to the migrant community, this institution wishes to award you an honorary distinction as an exemplary student. This recognition doesn't replace an official diploma, but honors your effort with the dignity it deserves. Maria closed her eyes. She breathed and smiled. She printed the recognition. She framed it. But she didn't hang it on the wall. She kept it on her most personal shelf next to her blue rosary, her notebook from the shelter, and the letter Valeria Dominguez once wrote her in blue ink. Your story doesn't end with a deportation stamp. It begins with the voice you decided not to silence. And today, Maria is 26 years old. She travels through Latin America, giving talks on migration, ethics, and resilience. She didn't study at Harvard. She doesn't have a master's degree, but her words make entire audiences cry because she doesn't speak from theory. She speaks from wounds and from healing. When asked if she regrets having gone to the United States, she responds calmly, If I hadn't gone, I wouldn't know who I really am. My diploma didn't come on paper. It came in the form of scars. And those aren't hung, they're worn with pride.